Good evening and welcome. My name is Rory Schaefer-Walsh, Vice President of Institutional Advancement at St. Joseph's College, and we are excited to present tonight's event, The Life of Mary, appropriately timed with the closing of the year of St. Joseph. Tonight, we dive into this legendary and miraculous woman, daughter, and mother to take an in-depth look into what is known and unknown about Mary and her legacy. We hope to get to questions from the audience towards the end of the program, so please feel free to use the Q&A function to submit yours. We have had a last-minute change, and in place of President Baumgarten will be Cristian Murphy, Director of the Long Island Campus Ministry. He, of course, will be joining Sister Elizabeth Johnson, Congregation of the Sisters of St. Joseph, and Ph.D. Now for introductions. Sister Elizabeth Johnson grew up in Brooklyn, New York, the oldest of 7 children, and as a young adult, she joined the religious order of the Sisters of St. Joseph, whose mother house is in Brentwood, Long Island. After receiving a Ph.D. in theology from Catholic University of America, she taught there for 10 years before moving to Fordham University, where she taught in both graduate and undergraduate programs. Professor, mentor, writer, editor, and public lecturer at home and abroad, she is a former president of the Catholic Theological Society of America and a former president of the American Theological Society. She loves to teach and was awarded Fordham University's Teaching Award in 1998 and Professor of the Year Award in 2011. Her book, She Who Is, garnered several honors, most notably the Grawemeyer Award in Religion. Her work has been translated into 13 languages. She has also written 2 books on Mary, Truly Our Sister, A Theology of Mary in the Communion of Saints, and The Dangerous Memory of Mary. Sister Elizabeth is a member of St. Joseph's College Board of Trustees, Professor Emeritus of Fordham, and the National Catholic Reporter has called her one of the country's most prominent and respected theologians. Welcome, Sister Elizabeth.
Thank you very much, Rory.
To join in the conversation is Cristian Murphy. Cristian has worked in religious education and ministry since graduating from St. Joseph's College in 2014. He received his master's in religious education from Fordham University. Currently, Cristian is in his 5th year as campus minister at St. Joseph's College for the Long Island campus. He is known for providing pastoral care to students and encouraging spiritual and moral growth while planning and directing faith-based programs and service activities. Welcome, Sister Elizabeth Johnson and Cristian Murphy.
Thank you. All right. Hey, Sister Elizabeth, how are you doing?
Very good. Looking forward to our conversation.
Me too. Thanks. This is so great to be here to do this. I'm so excited to learn and go on this journey with you here about the life of Mary. And so let's just dive right in. Let's start here with the writings on Mary. What are some of the first historical writings about Mary, and who can we look to when saying who wrote about her?
Well, the most reliable sources we have are the 4 Gospels and the Acts of the Apostles. So we're talking the New Testament in the Bible. So we have Mark, who wrote first around the year 70 AD, then Matthew and Luke around 80, and John around 90 to 100. Luke not only wrote a gospel that has Mary in it, but also the Acts of the Apostles, where the first chapter also has Mary mentioned. So those are our main reliable sources. I should add, in the 2nd, 3rd, and 4th centuries, there were other writings of Mary that have come forth. They are mainly legendary. Some of them call themselves gospels, like the Proto-Evangelium of James or whatever, but they don't have historical credibility the way the Gospels do.
What do you think about the ways in which Mary is portrayed in those writings and in various writings on Mary? How do you feel about that?
Well, if you just stay with the sources, if you stay with the New Testament, except for Mark, the other writers all present her fundamentally as a woman of faith. As someone whose faith made her make decisions that were difficult, that kept her on a path of fidelity toward God, that we see her in the Acts of the Apostles as part of the early Christian community after the resurrection, waiting for the Spirit at Pentecost, and so on. So she comes across, some people say she comes across as herself a disciple of Jesus, becoming a believer, or as a woman of faith, being herself Jewish woman, steeped in Old Testament faith in God. The only exception to that is Mark, the very first gospel writer, which he sees her somewhat as an outsider to the whole thing of Jesus' ministry. There's one thing I'd like to just point out. Mark in chapter 3 says, and I'm quoting here, when his family heard about his preaching, they went out to restrain him, saying, he has gone out of his mind. The crowds of people, and then it goes on in Mark that his mother and his brothers came, and standing outside, they sent and called to him. A crowd was sitting around, and they said to him, your mother and your brothers and sisters are outside asking for you. And he replied, who are my mother and brothers? And looking at those around him, he said, here are my mother and brothers. Whoever does the will of God is brother and sister and mother to me. So there's a sense there that the family, at least at the beginning of Jesus, but did not understand what he was up to. But you could be Jesus' brother or sister or mother if you believed in who he was. And she's ranked on the outside in that gospel. The other gospels all show her, if I can put it this way, on the inside.
I really like that you're shining a light on that, because in my conversations with students about Mary and this perspective of Christ, it's really important to remember that there were a lot of people who were questioning and were saying, so it's easy for us to look at these stories, and especially who were my brothers and sisters, and say, oh yeah, I would be there. Well, you might not be. You probably were intimidated too, because it's a pretty big thing for this man to be delivering these messages. Now, what's interesting about this?
Let me just say one thing. If you look at Mary in that, the Second Vatican Council, in writing on Mary, said her life was a journey of faith. And if you think about what that entails, like you go from not understanding to deeper understanding and fidelity. So being outside in Mark, which is the first written gospel, her faith brought her into a different situation along the way. I think it makes her more credible, actually, as a woman.
And it's important to say too that it all starts with a question, and it starts with the yes that she has to make. So there's that important part of it. It's not just an automatic. It starts with that question that in the situation that's presented to her. Now, why do you think this is interesting? Because Mark is written first, and for a long time that was kind of a question mark, because our knee jerk is Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John.
Right.
Now Mark is written first, and Mark has this perspective. Why don't the others, you think, have this, and why would they?
Well, most scholars say it's because she became an honored member of the early Christian church, the early Christian community in Jerusalem after Pentecost, because she is presented as being there in the upper room when the Holy Spirit arrives. And she was, when you ever have an honored person, man, then to have the mother of that person be there, she became more honored. And so the memory of her faith, her fidelity, and so on, permeated. And so the later gospel writers speak from that perspective.
Now, which do you, I don't know if prefer is the right word, but which look at Mary interests you the most? Or would you consider it to be the most fair and engaging?
Well, I like them all because they show the journey of faith. It's a more holistic view of her as a person. Like nobody is the same when they're, 50 as when they're 30, or as when they were 20 or when they were 15. And you could see in her own life, like a development. And I think that's what I like.
Yeah. And speaking to her life here, I'd love for you to share a bit about the socio-cultural world that Mary grew up in and how that formed her to be the Mary that we understand now.
Okay, so I just have 4 very quick points to make out. First, ethnically and religiously, her world was Jewish. She was a Jewish woman. Everyone around her in her village and in her family was Jewish. They observed the feast days, the Sabbath every Saturday. They would have Passover, go up to Jerusalem, and you see her do that in the gospel. So to put her in a Jewish context, and I know my own students sometimes, I say to them, Mary wasn't a Catholic. Well, that gets them going.
Yeah. What? How?
But think Jewish ethnically and also religiously, number one. Number two, in terms of economics, she was poor. She belonged to a group of people in ancient, first century Palestine, Israel today, that worked the land. She's in a hill country. The town of Nazareth was a small little farming village. There's archaeological digs have found nothing reflecting luxury in Nazareth. No glass bottles, a little perfume, and all the kinds of things you find in the bigger cities. It was a poor farming village, and she was married to the village carpenter, and did the hard work of a village woman. And with that comes, therefore, the question of literacy. Most girls in that situation were not educated. The boys were, so that they could read Torah in synagogue, but the girls weren't. So she would learn through hearing and the repetition of Psalms and so on, but not, the idea of, there's a German essay, what was Mary doing when the angel came? And the answer is reading a book. Well, the answer is, well, that's a nice imaginative idea, but that is not economically what she would have been doing if she even could read, let alone not have a book. All right. So poverty was part of her daily work. The third thing to bring out is that she was a woman in a patriarchal culture where men certainly had dominance in terms of gender. And the fourth thing to bring out is that politically, her whole country had been conquered by the Roman Empire, and the Roman soldiers were there, and the stringent taxation that was leveled by the emperor in order to get the goods from the conquered nations to promote the glory of Rome. So there was violence. There was a great deal of violence in her world as a conquered country. And I'll just point out, around the year 66 AD, but climaxing in 70 AD, the Jews themselves revolted against Roman occupation and lost. And so you have the diaspora, the destruction of the temple and so on, the burning of the cities, the ruination of their country. So she lived in a terribly tense time. So to say Jewish and poor and culturally in a patriarchal world and politically in a tense and violent world, that's culturally. Historically, if you want to place her in her own time and place as a real woman, that was her world.
And it's amazing how we don't talk about that more, because when knowing that information, it makes us respect and love her so much more, because it gives us so much more understanding of the real struggles that she would have been going through,
right,
as a woman in that time alone. But then add on top of the sacred mysteries that will be in her life.
It's important to keep this in mind when we talk about those what you call sacred mysteries, for this reason.
Yeah.
Like the question will come up: why did God? What does it say about God that God chose? Okay, if I could say an unknown, non-person, non-entity, peasant woman in a little conquered village. You look at our news today, you see women like her in the villages in El Salvador, you go around the world. It's that kind of thing, not somebody in a palace or wealthy or educated.
Well, yeah, and you think about too. You were saying that about the uneducated aspect, and it made me think of that young woman, Malalia, who became so well known, and as she should be, for writing those amazing books about women being educated. And so that puts it in perspective of like, oh yeah, there's something else to look at here. I also appreciate that you mentioned Nazareth, because people forget too when they're reading the Gospels about A, the language, the translations, but B, also the social language of the fact that sometimes using the title of Nazareth in the name was an insult. It wasn't just oh, this is where they're from. It also was like, can you believe this? This is what we're listening to. Mm-hmm. So I appreciate that you brought that into there. How do you think her image changed in the world later on through medieval Europe and 20th century America, knowing what we know?
Very clearly, as Christianity spread, each new culture that Christianity spread into took the Christian tradition and imaged it in its own image and likeness, if you will. And I would say as you said, in medieval Europe, if you think of the art that we get from medieval Europe in terms of Mary, she's always presented as a queen. She's dressed beautifully. She has a crown sometimes. She's holding the child very peacefully, and so on. And you just have to say to yourself, this was representing what they thought was giving her honor. Now, I'm not criticizing, all right? But it was a shift. And then when you get into the Germanic and Northern European countries, they start changing the way she's imaged in painting. So she gets blue eyes and blonde hair, which is never, I mean, she was a Semitic, Mediterranean looking woman, and they dress her in royal blue. And it's the kind of color that no peasant woman could ever afford. That was done people in the palaces, she would be wearing homespun brown kind of clothing as peasants would do. So the shift became, it detached her from her historical roots and brought her into people's hearts as a mother, as a queen, as somebody who could help in times of trouble. In contemporary terms, a number of theologians, not myself, but others, have said she became the maternal face of God. The more God became like a just father, the more Mary took on the merciful aspect of God toward people. There's one medieval cathedral where there's a carving of the last judgment, the judgment of a poor soul, and he's full of sins and the scales are weighing down like this. His sins will send him to hell. And you look over and Mary has her pinky in the other side, weighing the scales down toward mercy. She almost became, in the Middle Ages, more merciful than Christ. And that was Martin Luther's problem with Mariology, that she had replaced him. So it's fascinating study to see how her image has been so malleable and how it has been taken into so many different cultures and reshaped according to the needs of that culture and also the theology that they were doing at that time. So all I can say is we need new art, and we absolutely need new art, new stained glass windows, new holy cards to bring something, if you have an historical imagination, back to her own reality.
It's so interesting too how you said that it was most likely it was done out of respect. So it's fascinating how it can start as a form of respect, but how it can really deviate. And because the other thing too about art is that art belongs to those that witness it after a while. So if we're not witnessing it properly and we take it into certain ways, then we can totally lose track of what the purpose was originally, which is what it sounds like happened to Mary. And it's also happened to Christ too, in so many of the images of this perfect looking. I always joke with the students how when we see a crucifix, I don't like to see Christ, like looking like a superhero with all these muscles on a crucifix. It's not. He was withered. He was hurting, and so it's important to see that humanity aspect as well.
Other thing. Let me just say one other thing happened to her image, and I grew up with this in a pre-Vatican II church in New York. She became more and more posed to women as a model of obedience and of passivity, of doing whatever God says. And of course, the mouthpiece for that would be the husband, the pastor, the male leader. So the reaction of many women when the feminist movement first began and came into theology was to reject Mary because she was a symbol of women's subordination.
Wow.
So that also has to be brought out as an issue why some women still run the other way. Yeah. Now, I'm going to make the argument in a few minutes that isn't historically accurate, but that again was part of the cultural changes that went on.
Yeah, exactly. It's important, and whether it's accurate, it's important to acknowledge what was happening and what ramifications could be happening due to the way the story naturally progresses, or we progress it. I'm curious here about Mary's parents, something that we don't hear about a lot. Mary's parents and what growing up was like possibly for her. What do we know about that aspect of Mary's life?
Almost nothing. in truth,
Yeah.
one of the later apocryphal gospels that I mentioned gives us names of her parents, which have come down to us, but they're not in the actual gospels that are part of our New Testament. That her father's name was Joachim and her mother's name was Anne or Anna, and that they were old and that they didn't have a child, and they prayed, and then Mary was given. And that gospel has some beautiful passages. When she was a little girl, they brought her to the temple to dedicate her to God. And she danced up the steps
Yes.
of the temple. And the high priest stood back, and all of Israel loved her. There's just charming things like that. But truthfully, in other words, she grew up in a family that was not wealthy, that was not educated. The kind of marriage that they made for her was in a peasant area with another poor man. And she would just have had the kind of upbringing that girls had at that time, which was basically being prepared to be married and have children and do the hard work of maintaining a household in that kind of way. The one thing I'll just put in, which again, we hardly ever think of, in John's gospel at the crucifixion scene, he says this, and he's the only one to say this: standing near the cross of Jesus were his mother and his mother's sister. So Jesus' aunt was there. And always, when I first realized, I said, I'm so glad she had her sister there. Sisters are wonderful, to have nearby. And then it names Mary, the wife of Clopas, and Mary Magdalene. And there were other women as well. So she grew up in some sort of a household where she wasn't the only child, apparently, according to John's memory here. But it was just an unknown, hidden kind of girlhood.
Yeah, well, exactly. Because you said the girlhood part, because especially the fact that she's a woman, especially will be hidden even more to what details are out there. Which leads into the argument of how old was she when she became pregnant, and there's a lot of different theories about that, but yeah, what are your thoughts on that?
Well, again, to stay with the historical information we have from that period of time, life expectancy was short.
Yes.
And the idea was, once a girl and a boy reached puberty, they would be married and they would begin to bear children, many of whom would die in infancy.
Yeah.
And then finally, continue to reproduce the race, kind of thing.
Mm-hmm.
So the obvious thing is at the age of puberty for Mary to have been considered a marriageable age in that culture. That's how it was done. So, 12, 13, 14, somewhere in that vicinity.
Wow. Yeah. And then how old do you think she was when she died?
Well, here's the thing. If Jesus was crucified when he was about 30, 33, and she conceived him, let's say when he was 15, she was 15, let's say she'd be in her mid 40s at that point.
Which is considered pretty good at that time.
Pretty good, right? Yeah. And then she was part of that early Jerusalem community,
right?
After the coming of the Spirit. And after that, we hear nothing more about her life. That's in the Gospels, that's historically reliable. So how old was she? She had lived to middle age, or 40, in her mid 40s, and beyond that, how much longer, we just don't know.
Yeah, the what ifs are so interesting, and especially looking at the year of St. Joseph too. The what ifs there are so fascinating. What do you think was her personality and her temperament like? We have a lot of ideas about that too, and then we take spins on it too. So yeah, what are your thoughts on that?
Well, I would just say Mary has more to say in the New Testament than any other woman. So if you look at the texts that are attributed to her by the gospel writers, you get this idea of a woman, let's say in Luke's Annunciation scene, when the angel Gabriel appears and, you have been chosen by God to bear a son-in-law. The first thing she does is ask questions. How can this be? Give me more information. She's smart. She's asking what's happening here. Right away after that, she goes through the hill country to visit her cousin Elizabeth, who is pregnant with who turns out to be John the Baptist, right? So, and Elizabeth blesses her. And Mary lets loose with this hymn of praise of God that is a revolutionary song of justice. We call it today the Magnificat, from the opening words in Latin. My soul magnifies the Lord. So she praises God for being merciful to her, who's just a poor, humble, simple woman, nobody, right? But then she goes on and proclaims, in the words of the prophets of old, what is going to happen in the Messianic age. So God is going to put down the mighty from their thrones and exalt the lowly. It's going to fill the hungry with good things and send the rich away empty. Is going to fulfill the promise of mercy that was made to Abraham. And so it's just this glorious song of salvation, And I once had a student say, we were studying this in class. She said, well, the apple doesn't fall far from the tree. If Jesus gets up and starts proclaiming these same kinds of things, he had a mother who had that kind of vision. So she was, as I said earlier, in response to how she's portrayed, a woman of faith. But what I mean by that, biblical faith, prophetic faith, faith of the Jewish tradition, that God's coming comforts the brokenhearted and brings justice to the oppressed. That's the kind of faith that you see in her, from this song and from other things that are said throughout the rest of the New Testament.
Wow, I really like the apple doesn't fall far from the tree commentary, because I taught a class this semester on Jesus the Christ, and the class ended up being a journey of understanding the human and the divine, and how we understand that and how we misunderstand it too. And we ended up revisiting in a lot of our conversations how our parents have influenced us, and how we also have to remember that Jesus's parents influenced him as well. And so this is kind of off script here for a moment, but I'm really intrigued here. What do you think from Jesus's journey in his life? What are some of the things that you think you look at that you like to think that Mary was really? Because there's obviously some things that we could say that Joseph taught him how to be a carpenter, most likely. But what's something that you look at and say that's a Mary right there?
Care about the poor. Look for those who are in need, and know that God is with them and is directing us to do something about that, to care for them as well. I think it's that kind of compassion and that kind of looking. For example, let me give another story from John's Gospel, the wedding at Cana. It's very interesting to think of Mary dancing, but that's what you do when you go to a wedding, right? You dance with Jesus as well. But they were running out of wine. And as John tells the story, she noticed. And she says to the steward, she says to Jesus, she turns to and says, they have no wine. And basically he says, what do you want me to do about it? And she says to the steward, do whatever he tells you. And of course, there's that famous changing the jars of water into wine. And the idea is she noticed. Nobody told her.
Yeah.
She had that eye out for how is this party going, and this wedding of a poor couple who put everything into this festive meal and didn't have enough money to buy enough wine. It's things like that. And then she tells Jesus to do something about it. So there's a clear influence going on there of caring for those who are needy, even just because their wedding might be cut short.
Yeah, it's in the little things, and that idea too, that it was written that she noticed. Like there's so many moments in the Gospels where the language is so clear that it doesn't say she saw. It's like she noticed, and so you see that a lot too, and that's really fascinating.
And the way I have written about it is to say, let us continue to hear her say that they have no wine. To us in the church today, nor no food, nor no healthcare, nor no shelter. Like, who are the people today that have no wine? And if we're thinking of Mary, if she's in our company as a revered person in the communion of saints, then we need to step forward the way Jesus did and do something.
Yeah, and of all people to notice that, it would be someone who has lived through tougher moments. And in a lot of the work that we do with the students, where we end up working with people who are in some tough moments, they always end up having the best look on life and understanding because they've been through those moments. And that's what Mary's showing us right there too, that they're going to notice. What do you think it says about God that Mary was chosen to have Christ, to bear this incredible weight?
Well, it says what Mary said in her song, the Magnificat, that God looks upon the lowly and blesses them and chooses this. I use the word non-person, which comes from liberation theology, the peasant, the person considered of no importance in worldly affairs, to do this. So there were plenty of women who had more prestige than Mary in her own day that could have been asked, or chosen, tapped, but it's a tremendous example of the heart of God, who looks upon the lowly and sees there the grace and the goodness and calls them. So it's a tremendous revelation of who God is, that Mary is the one chosen, if you put her in her historical context.
Yeah, and it also says so much about God's plan. Again, it's like amazing how much of a blueprint it is for how we can understand our life, and that success is so relative, and it's a tricky word. And like, what does all that mean? Because we're clearly being shown that the lowly, the ones that are having the difficulties, are God's people. Maybe sometimes even more so than sometimes others. We're all God's people, but there's something about that. I have on one of the mission trips I was on years ago, I had a campus minister friend of mine say to me, we were in Peru, and we were in one of the poorest areas of Peru, and he said to me, he's like, God, I love it here. I was like, why? He's like, the people here just have such faith, and they make me really question where I'm at and how I understand my faith, and just being here just grounds me so much. Mm-hmm. And it was really profound. I never thought of it like that before. Now here's a big thing, right? So then Mary is given this news and this fiat, this yes, and now
let me just say that she's given an invitation.
Yes. Okay. Then she takes it. She says yes. Yeah.
She has a response.
Right. The biggest word, one of the most important words of all, invitation in this regard. But then what does the world around her say now? What do you think life was like for her after this experience happened here, and how do things change for her?
Well, you have to remember that at this point, at least according to Matthew and Luke both, she was already married. And imagine explaining this to your husband when he knows it's not his child, because marriage took place in that era in two stages. And in the first stage, it was an official stage. You were betrothed, but you lived apart for about a year. And stage two, the family brought the bride to the husband's house, and then they lived together as man and wife. But it was in that first stage of marriage. Now, Joseph was called her husband. She was called his wife. And when he found out, he had the thought that he would divorce her. So notice that language. It wasn't just, they weren't just engaged. An awful lot of Americans put our custom on that story, but it's not. It was much more serious and formal that they were in fact married, and he could divorce her. But he chose not to, because again, he too was led by the Spirit to see that this was the work of God. So how her life changed, it became dangerous all of a sudden. She was a woman of scandal at that point, and would have been worse so if Joseph hadn't responded the way he did. And then clearly she went on to bear a child. And as both Matthew and Luke show it to us, that it was not under optimum conditions. She far from home and gave birth in a barn. This is not what you would want to do for your firstborn son,
We're doing here on the campus, we're doing for Advent a Visio Divina group, where we're gathering weekly and looking at images of the Nativity, various images, and the images that were selected from the artists that put this program together all have shepherds in various places who have these faces of like, what? And so we're finding ourselves in the exploration of this, of going, oh yeah, this is kind of insane. Like, this is kind of wild to imagine. We're so used to it. When we look, and especially now, you're driving around and you see nativity scenes, you say, yeah, but then it's important to remember, no, this was wild. This was so unique. And now, what do you think, what does this moment do for Catholic history? Why does it make Catholic history so important, this moment?
Well, clearly it's because it's the beginning of the coming of Christ, of Jesus Christ, and so there's something in human way of remembering somebody who's really important that likes to go back and tell the story of their childhood or their birth or something like that. It started at the beginning. And what we have here in the Gospels of the infancy narratives is the story of Jesus's beginning and the coming of Christ and everything that follows from that for those who are disciples of Christ, who are believers and Christian believers. So it's the beginning of the coming of the Messiah. It's the coming of the Word of God in the flesh into the world, taking flesh from Mary herself. It's pivotal in Catholic history. Yeah.
And it means so much more too, with the knowing Mary and knowing the journey of Mary to this point. It just gives it so much more intense meaning, as it should. Now, I mentioned before Malala, because you got me thinking about that story of Malala, and now I got my brain going too, thinking of how we can see Mary in the world. And so we look at Islam in the Muslim faith, and it's not many people know this, but Mary has one of the highest positions in Islam as a woman, and is mentioned more in the Quran than the Bible. Let's let that sit for a minute, right?
Yep.
Why is this, and what role does Mary play in the Islamic faith?
Well, as you mentioned in the Quran names her numerous times and tells many stories about her. But if I can say this, they hold her up, if I boil it down, for two reasons. One is that God has chosen her. But secondly, she conceived Jesus by the breath of the Spirit, gave birth to Jesus, and was this woman of faith who believed sincerely and completely, and the Islamic phrase, submitted herself to God's will. So they see her as the ideal, really, person of faith, the way Christians do, Abraham, our father in faith, Mary carrying that faithfulness forward, that she was committed to prayer, that she did the will of God. And they have a story that's interesting. When she gives birth, she goes away by herself into the desert. There's no Joseph, there's no Bethlehem. It's a different version. And she has a very hard time, and she shakes the date tree, and some dates come down to nourish her and so on. But in the end, she gives birth to Jesus, and she returns to her village. And there's all this criticism of her now, because here she is with a baby. And where's the man? You know what I mean? So again, the way a village would talk and what they would look down on her and so on. And as the Quran says, and the child from the cradle speaks up in defense of his mother. So you can see the kind of story it is. But he was defending her. But what they see there, again, it's that feeling of danger that runs through this pregnancy, of her being put in that kind of position, but nevertheless her submission to the will of God, as a good a person in the Islamic tradition would do. So if I could just say this, there are mosques named after Mary in Australia and Ireland, other places. In this country, there's one in Chicago, there's one in Berkeley. And a number of Muslim women, maybe not necessarily so overtly as Catholic women do, but they wear a little medal with Mary on it, a little medallion or something, and seeing her, a sister in faith, a woman like themselves, and somebody who had tremendous faith in God under very hard circumstances. And so they find her tremendously supportive in their own life.
That is so awesome. And it's really remarkable to know that information. But it makes sense as you're saying. I'm thinking about it. Well, Mary was Jewish. And so, like you said earlier, she lived the Jewish life. And the Jewish life was one that was about submission as well, and about surrender, but also was about steadfast prayer. And so then when you look at the Islamic life, there's a real practice to the faith. And so it makes total sense that there would be this tremendous amount of respect for someone like Mary, and also the seriousness for which she has faith in God. Because that's, I mean, I have a few friends who are Muslim, and one very close friend of mine, and we've had so many wonderful conversations about the prayer life. And it's remarkable, the submission that comes with that that experience and the dedication. And so it makes total sense when you say it like that. So thank you for that insight. You mentioned in there Dangerous Mary. And so this is just great. Your second book on Mary that you wrote focuses mainly on the New Testament stories, and you called it The Dangerous Memory of Mary. So that's an awesome title. Can you explain that title a little bit more and how we can look at Mary as dangerous?
Yes, well, I actually am borrowing the idea of a dangerous memory from the German theologian Johannes Baptist Metz. And he talks about the dangerous memory of suffering in the tradition of Christianity. We have the suffering Christ, we have the cross, and we have all of these saints and martyrs and people who have suffered down through the ages. And the suffering, as it comes to, if we don't block it out, and he's very afraid that bourgeois societies turn toward comfort and we want to block it out. We just want our little pleasures and all. But if we attend to the dangerous memory of the passion of Christ and so on, and what it will do is shake us up inside so that we don't compromise with the powers that oppress others, compromise with evil, and that we will rise up and have our own integrity and live lives of more self-reflection and be better people. So I borrowed that idea, and because of the tradition of Mary being so passive and so innocuous, to say what's dangerous about this woman. And wrote this book with the idea of bringing out from the scriptures themselves, not just trying to make it up, but say it's there if we read it rightly, that she was a woman who knew what God was about, both the way she was treated in her life and the way the Jewish tradition of prophecy speaks about what God is doing for the salvation of the world. And she was not afraid to speak that out. So I mentioned the Magnificat before, and I'd like to just end by saying to anyone who wants to read it, if you go to Luke's Gospel, chapter 1, it's the last verses of chapter 1. And there is a comment on it by the German theologian Dietrich Bonhoeffer, a theologian who was opposed to Hitler and captured and hanged by the Nazis in 1945. But he writes about this prayer of Mary, this song, the Magnificat. And he said, and I quote, "It is at once the most passionate, the wildest, one might even say the most revolutionary Advent hymn ever sung. This is not the gentle, tender, dreamy Mary whom we sometimes see in paintings. This is the passionate, surrendered, proud, enthusiastic Mary who speaks out here. This song has none of the sweet, nostalgic, or even playful tones of some of our Christmas carols. It is instead a hard, strong, inexorable song about collapsing thrones and humbled lords of this world, about the power of God and the powerlessness of humankind, God's justice arriving. These are the tones of the prophets of the Old Testament that now come to life in Mary's mouth." Now I say a woman like that is dangerous. Dangerous to complacency, dangerous to injustice, dangerous to bourgeois comfortable mentality. She shakes it up in the name of God.
I think it's hard to think of what could ever top that. That's pretty powerful, and it's a wonderful way to look at Mary. So thank you for that, Sister Elizabeth.
We need new Christmas cribs too. We need new nativity sets. I think the art, yeah.
So we do have some questions from our audience that I'd like to put out there. So one of the first questions we have is, at the cross, Jesus tells Mary that John is her son and that she is his mother, paraphrased. In that culture, women were sent to other family if there was no husband. Do we assume that Joseph is dead, or do historians know otherwise?
We assume that Joseph is dead. And one of the main reasons is not only that passage, which is correct, but all the way through the ministry, when the mother and the brothers show up, there is no father. And the conclusion that scholars draw is that it's because he had died. And so Mary is still surrounded by men who could protect her, her sons, and so, or the stepsons or cousins, whoever they are. But she herself is, she's never portrayed with her husband once Jesus is past the age of 12 and found in the temple. So it's really the argument from silence, which you could say doesn't prove everything. But the idea would be if Joseph were around, he would be showing up somewhere in that picture, because the mother and the brothers and the sisters and the aunt and all these other family members are there somewhere mentioned, and Joseph is not mentioned. So it's assumed that he had died by that time, and she was a widow, therefore.
Just Elizabeth, a follow-up question to that. I was a student and I were talking about this recently. I'm curious, what do you think spiritually does the death of Joseph and the missing of Joseph do to the value of Jesus's ministry, his story, and then Mary's presence?
What does it do to it?
Yeah, like what is it? How does it impact the way that we now look at Christ in this story that we don't know about Joseph's passing? We don't have him there.
Well, there's a whole tradition of Joseph as the patron of a happy death, and that he died with Mary and Jesus to either side of him. That if he had died at home and they were there, I mean, clearly that would be the normal way. There weren't any hospitals or anything. So, but that then he was, Jesus had to take responsibility then for the household. And he continued as a carpenter for a number of years, or was a carpenter when he began his public ministry. So, it was not unusual in that day. We talked about life expectancy not right. being that low. So to have a father die, before the son was completely grown, that would not be that unusual.
Well, we have another question, and this question comes in from Sarah. She wants to know, isn't the appearance of Mary tied to the Marian apparitions and how she appeared? I don't remember any apparitions where Mary was not a beautiful queen.
Well, let me say, the apparition that we have of Our Lady of Guadalupe, she is indigenous at that point, more modeled on the Aztec god, the woman goddess, the goddess who was the god for the indigenous people that the Spanish had just conquered and were treating absolutely miserably. The appearance of Our Lady of Lourdes, let's say in France in the 19th century, or again, Our Lady of Fatima in Portugal in the early 20th century. Both of those women look like Europeans. I mean, they're white and they're dressed in more European kind of dress and so on. And you could go around the world, and there's a whole study many studies are done. Whoever has a vision of Mary sees her in their own context as one of their own kind of people. So you can't say, so there's an imagination going on, and some, I think, very astute spiritual interpreters say those who have these kinds of visions, they are being led by the Spirit in their own spiritual journey to a deeper connection with God through who they're seeing Mary to be. But what's available to them by way of imagination is what's there in their own culture. So it's not that you should take these apparitions as showing us what the historical Mary looked like. It's 1,000 and plus years later, and it's something else. It's a different kind of phenomenon.
All right, thank you. You did touch on this a little bit when you were speaking, but I'm going to read the question anyway. Anthony would like you to say a few words about the theology of Mary found in the Magnificat.
Just happen to have a lot to say about that. that here she is at the beginning of Luke's gospel, praising God who has blessed this poor, humble woman. And as one of my feminist theologian colleagues wrote, she is not praising God because she is so happy to be pregnant. She is praising God because through this pregnancy, the salvation of God is coming into the world. And that's the theology of that prayer. And she's a cooperator in that. She is partner in that, through her own person, through her own life. And then she goes on to bring it beyond her personal self to the social events and the social context of suffering in which she exists, But even when she's saying brings down the mighty from their thrones and exalts the low, she is one of the people who's lowly. That's meant that she's singing about in that hymn. She is one of the hungry, if you will, not one of the rich. She is one of those receiving mercy, not spurning it, and so on. So what she sings about in that hymn is about the absolute overwhelming love of God, inclusively poured out into this world through this coming of Christ. And not only is she bringing Christ into the world, but in this Magnificat, she is proclaiming it in word. She's singing about it.
All right. Well, thank you. Do we have any closing comments? We're done with our questions. So do you have any closing thoughts?
Cristian, you've been.
I just want to say thank you for this. This was really exciting and inspiring. This especially as we're a week away from Christmas here, to look at the word lowly came up numerous times, and so I feel a real charge to prayerfully discern how I interact with everybody in my midst, and the ways in which I can be more aware of seeing Mary in everybody that I encounter. And so I feel really inspired by that. So I thank you for that, for the way that I think we could take that in our life.
Right. I would just add, I skipped over the infancy narratives very quickly because I knew we had a lot that we wanted to get to. But if I can go back, now that we're in Advent, as you said, just before Christmas, when you look at Matthew's account of the birth of Jesus, it goes very quickly into danger that you can hardly imagine, that they find out from the Magi that Herod wants to kill the child. And they flee, as we call it, the flight into Egypt. And Herod goes and kills all those infants. But then you look at Mary and Joseph and their child. They are in a foreign country. They do not speak the language. Maybe Joseph has a skill that he can use and make a little money, but they don't belong there. They are what we would call today refugees. And they're looking for a port in a storm. You look at Mary in that perspective. Think of what goes on in a woman who has a little child and is trying to get to safety. And their name in our world today is Legion, millions of women going through like that. So this is, again, another dangerous aspect of Mary, but they were put through by an unjust political ruler. They had to run for their lives. There are other things like that. In other words, you mentioned the shepherds before. In Luke, shepherds are out on the hills. They were considered very lowly in the Jewish tradition. They could not observe the cleanliness and the right customs of washing and so on, because they're out there with the animals all the time. They're a lowly little group of people. We've romanticized them, and we've made the Magi into these three kings, and we keep, I almost want to say, missing what's going on at the heart of this thing, is that this is tough. This is a hard story, that a woman has to leave her home, go register, and gives birth. There's no room in the inn. They're out in a barn. Was there? Well, the later apocryphal gospels say Joseph went out looking for a midwife. Well, one can only hope he found one. But I mean, we don't have any of that in the Gospels, although our imagination would love to fill in that. But to wrap your child in swaddling clothes and not have any place to lay him except the trough from which animals eat, on and on. In other words, there's poverty here, and there's danger, and there's displacement. And I think, to me, the Christmas story comes across as tremendously challenging when you take it in its own real historical context.
All right. Well, what a great discussion. I want to thank you, Sister Elizabeth and Cristian, for providing us with an evening of inspiration. Also, thanks to all of you for joining us during this third week of Advent, and we wish you a very happy holiday season and a very Merry Christmas. Thanks again.
Welcome. Night.